Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Orange Team podcast. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to be talking about the winds of change in the game development scene, the human need for stories, and whether or not we're streaming ourselves to our doom. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
All right, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us again for the Orange Team podcast. I'm Leighton. This is Mitch, and you're in for a treat today. I think we got some pretty cool stuff we're going to talk about.
We do have a couple good topics, changes in the winds of game development, and are we streaming to our doom? Both topics picked by Leighton. So I am curious to hear what sparked maybe our first topic here, change in the winds of game development.
So a lot of it stemmed from my own personal tastes in games, but also just watching the hype machine behind like what games are people getting hyped about. And I'm noticing the games that I'm hearing the most about aren't the AAAs as much anymore. They're the indie games. Like, would you consider Pal World an indie game?
100%, yeah.
Yeah, and it is literally one of the most talked about games, one of the most just insane. And then think about Lethal Company, indie game, blew everyone out of the water. Among Us, super popular. Like, these are games that have literally built careers for people, and they're just indie games, and they're not even like. And I do not want to devalue any of these games because I don't think a game is defined by how big it is or the graphical fidelity, but they're not games that blow your socks off like, wow, that game looks like a movie, like an Uncharted or something, or Spider-Man. They're just really fun games. And so the Winds of Change is kind of the title I use for this because I feel like we're seeing a movement of people there were people that used to say, well, I'll only buy AAA games. Indie games they just wouldn't give indie games a chance. And now that AAA games are starting to take so long to develop, so we're not getting as many, they're starting to come out with a lot of issues. We're getting bugs and glitches, and they're costing more money, and they're under-delivering on the things they promised on, as well as just indie games getting better. Like, generally speaking, I feel like indie developers have just absolutely knocked it out of the park with some of the quality, just the uniqueness of what they're creating. I just feel like there's a shift where now the market's shifting where people are more open to trying indie games because they're cheaper and more fun. And so, yeah, I was just curious about your perspective on this, Mitch, being an indie game developer. Obviously, this sounds great, but like, do you feel that there's truth to that? Or do you feel that maybe it's a little overblown and AAAs are still completely, controlling the market?
Well, like you said, I'm going to be a little biased in my answer. But the first thing I wanted to touch on was something you said about holding up Pal World. And then the second game you mentioned was Lethal Company. Right there, two indie games. Like, we would kind of put them in the same category. In the same way that if you were talking about Halo and Gears of War, you'd say, oh, those are two AAA games. So, Pal World, Lethal Company, two indie games. They had drastically different budgets, and they had drastically different a drastically different amount of manpower working on each game. I think Lethal Company was a solo developer working in Unity, and Pal World was obviously a team coming fresh off the heels of another relatively successful title for them, Craftopia. I think it's Craftopia. Pretty sure it is. But the point being is that indie has become a genre unto itself, like a flavor, right? Like, we can have an indie strategy game, an indie city builder, an indie shooter. Think about Helldivers 2, which just came out. That is a co-op, third-person, kind of an action. It kind of reminds me of the Horde mode from Gears of War or Firefight, right? But then indie becomes a modifier for those underlying games, and it tends to mean, yes, lower budget, maybe less smaller teams, less developers working on each title. But especially as the Helldivers 2 developers have been kind of putting their money where their mouth is, indie also tends to mean less predatory monetization schemes. More what you pay for is what you get, and you get as much game as they have completed. That doesn't mean they won't leverage early access as a way to raise funds for the rest of development, or kind of buy them a little bit more of a runway before really committing to that 1.0 release. But indie devs are noticing this shift, and it's not a new shift, and it's certainly not it's not going to go away. The move towards all of these microtransactions. And when I say microtransactions, I'm not just referring to like a mission pack or, what we used to call expansion packs. We're talking about paying $30 for a cosmetic skin, like we're seeing in Overwatch and other games. Now that's a really fun way for you to throw some money around if you really like a game and almost like tip the developers. But what we're seeing in the indie space is people pushing back against that idea of everything being nickeled and dimed all the way to the bank, and just saying, hey, we're going to make as complete of a game as we can, and we're going to sell it to you for X amount, and then you've got the game. We're not going to play games with hiding some of it away from you, or, well, that second campaign wasn't quite done, so we're going to release it this many months after launch for another $20, so you feel like you got half a game. They're just giving you the game, and that's a place where indie developers are uniquely positioned to capitalize, because they don't answer to shareholders. They don't have as many layers of abstraction between themselves and the market. Having worked at an indie game developer and now working at what was sort of an otherwise independent development studio as well, there was the freedom. We had the freedom to just kind of decide what we felt in our hearts the right decision was to make and then do it. We didn't have to ask permission. I could walk straight into the CEO's office and say, hey man, here's the situation, here's what we should do, and he would go, okay, and to say yes or no right there. And we didn't have to have a meeting or assemble the board or anything like that. And so you're seeing that sort of mobility and flexibility in indie developers in a way that AAAs can't match. And that's going to be their strength, I think, moving forward into this next chapter of gaming, whatever's coming up next. But the future does look bright. We've got Palworld, we've got Helldivers, and other games like, forgive me, but that game you were playing on the Switch, Ultimate Unicorn.
Ultimate Chicken Horse, yeah.
Thank you. That one, correct me if I'm wrong, that's an indie game as well, is it not?
Pretty sure. I mean, it definitely gives off indie game vibes, so...
it's got the flavor.
It's got that indie flavor. Yeah, it's and I funny with Ultimate Chicken Horse, it feels like a polished Flash game. And so for those, most people I would think listening would know, but for those who might not know, back in the day, and they're still around, I guess, but not like they used to be, but Flash games were the thing. Like back in the day, in the early days of the internet, people would make these amazing, silly little games, not super high fidelity, but just really, really fun cartoon games. And a lot of those people have gone on to become proper developers now. It's actually kind of wild. The game Snipper Clips was made by a team of people that used to be called Super Flash Bros, that used to make cartoons on Newgrounds and also continued to make games on there. And yeah, now they're making full-on games for the Switch and PC and other places. So, that's kind of where I see the indie scene. Not that like it's like Flash, but it's kind of like in that same era of like creativity and, like you said, not being held back by stockholders and corporations and suits and people that are just looking to make a buck. But these are people that are passionate about what they're making. They're doing it because they love it, not because, back then they were doing it just because, because they love it. It's fun, rather than for money. And so I think the problem we're seeing now is that these companies are getting so big that there's so many mouths to feed in those companies, and it's not, honestly, it's more about the publishers wanting to make a lot of money and appeal to their shareholders. But these companies are very big. They have a lot of employees, in so many different departments that they have a lot of money riding on these games. Now there's so much risk. And this is a problem not just in the gaming industry, but you see it in the movie industry right now too, where budgets have ballooned so far out that they can't afford for them to not do well. So they take less chances. and less risks, and they stick to what they think by the numbers will do well. But we're seeing now there's a shift where people are no longer biting that apple anymore. They're going after different fruit. So
Yeah.
we've gotten tired of the same old, same old. I mean, you can only make so many Call of Duties and so many Assassin's Creeds and so many Maddens and so many FIFAs and so many, without making a change to the point where people are like, this is like a good example is Battlefield, right? And this that game
Right.
just kind of got stale, but then BattleBit came out, and it's just this really low graphics version of the old school Battlefield that people are just flocking to because it's so fun. So I think that the big challenge for these companies, especially these large companies, you can't really just roll back time and go back to the way things were. You've hired all these people, you've got these shareholders, you're tied to these companies. Like, how do you fix it other than crashing and burning? I guess it's kind of a scary thing for these development studios who there's so much pressure, right? Whereas an indie developer, not that there isn't pressure, you obviously need to pay your bills, but I think there's a lot more freedom, and that's where you see that creativity shine. So anyway, it's an interesting look at just people in general, not just game development.
Yeah, and you've got a comment here in the notes where you said it feels like we're being constantly let down by AAA studios with false promises or botched launches that eventually get patched. I mean, we're seeing that right now with Counter-Strike 2. Matt, a mutual friend of ours, sent me a Reddit post today of another big bug in Counter-Strike 2. And like it says Slenderman exclamation point. And it's like this guy's defending, the B site on Anubis, and the counter-terrorist runs in and just completely spaghettifies. And just like he grows to be 20 feet tall, arms like reaching around the pillar. It was horrifying. But the funny thing was, you could tell that the hitbox somehow actually followed whatever monstrous thing occurred in the animation engine or whatnot to that model. And so it's like he was shooting at him, but he wasn't able to hit him because he was now Slenderman and not just the CT that ran in the door. How many months are we post quote unquote launch for CS2? Like, I think it was September. Technically, it soft launched, I think, in maybe June.
Yeah.
They've even gone so far as to force, like, CSGO is gone. It's not even like a beta you can opt into. They've shut down everything CSGO related. All competition, and I should point out competition with hundreds of thousands of dollars in prize money, is being played on CS2, which is, by all accounts, on the struggle bus at best, and not there yet. And they opted not to let it cook more.
Very unvalve-like.
Very unvalve-like. And that could be a conversation unto itself, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. I wanted to make a comment. You mentioned kind of like fruit, right? We want to bite into a different apple, right? I think there's something else to consider here, is that for the longest time, AAA meant that it would get that time in the oven, that it would have a dedicated quality assurance team who would put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of man hours into squashing at least the most common or most show-stopping bugs. But nowadays, we've reached a point where it feels like a small 12-man team with a shoestring budget can put out a game of equivalent quality and quality assurance as a AAA studio. I mean, and we saw this as far back as Mass Effect Andromeda. That game was absolutely a nightmare and absolutely undercooked. And it comes to the point where if you're looking at two games on the Steam store, and one is $60 and that's a AAA, and one is at $30 or $40 and it's an indie studio, and in your mind, like, hey, they're probably going to be about the same level of quality. And for all I know, the indie studio, it's not going to be focus grouped to death. Whatever their core gameplay mechanic is, they really believe in it. And then, of course, there's the underdog story of feeling like you are supporting a small 12-man team, which, frankly, not all indie studios are. Some of them have gotten rather large. Consider Colossal Order developing City Skylines, or consider... man, you mentioned Among Us, but the funny thing is, like, those folks have some cash now, and I kind of wonder what they're going to do with it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
But yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's interesting you're bringing up the team size and the money, and I think this is actually a really interesting subject that a lot of people have brought up before, and that is, how do you define an indie game anymore? So, back in the day, it was kind of like one person or a team of three people, or it was like some small team. Maybe, I don't know what the number you would have to put before you would say they're no longer indie, but it's interesting because, yeah, these teams that start out small, they made a few successful games, now they're big. And, but we still call them indie because they're not from one of the main publishers, right? So, but are they still indie because they self-publish, or like I guess, where do we define that anymore? Is there like a middle, like something in between indie and well, I don't want to call triple A, indie and mainstream publishing? It's
Would that
kind
be
of,
single A or double A?
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
Something like
like
I
the
don't know.
battery.
The battery. It's a D battery.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. It's a weird thing. It's a weird. How do you define it anymore? But there's. I just think that there's a wider spectrum now. It used to be so much harder to get a game on a system, and now with the internet, and we've talked about this before now, but with these new means of publishing games, either through a system like Steam or self-publishing on your own website, there's no reason you can't get a game on the internet. Obviously, there's challenges, but at the end of the day, there's no one stopping you, and that's wild. So yeah, I don't know where we draw the line on defining when we talk about indies too. Like, if someone might be saying, "Well, what do that's not indie," or that, like you said, the people make Among Us, they've got money now. The guy that made Lethal Company's got money now, and that was just one
Yeah.
guy.
Guy got paid.
He got paid big time. So, yeah. I mean, can Pal World's kind of indie, but yeah, like you said, they've made games before. They had money. They have a team. And the game definitely has its problems, but it also doesn't look half bad. I mean, not that the looks should define a game. So, and I think the thing you
Let's do
said,
that.
I want to bring that up. Actually, this is something that you said, and I want to get a little more follow up on this. Is that you
Yeah,
mentioned
for
like
sure.
like someone could a AAA game versus an indie game, $60 versus $30 to $40, but they could be the same quality. Like, where, I guess, how do you define the quality of a game now? Like, I mean, because we tend to think of like, oh, well, AAA's, they have the best graphics, right? And massive scope. Like, you have your Starfields with all the voice acting and all the and everything. But then, but is that quality, or is that just they can produce more content? So the quality of game, how would you define? How do you equivalate? How would you make figure? You know what I'm
Equivalent. I
saying?
love it.
How would
I
you?
love it so
I'm
much.
going to use that word. Okay, how do you equivalate
Those are
between a AAA and an indie as far as quality?
okay. I have never been on the graphics equals quality train. And that's been true all the way back. Graphics can be like, graphics are cool. I remember playing the first Far Cry in, what was that, 2004? And I
Yeah.
remember having to go get, like, let me see what year that came out. But I remember having to go get and beg my dad to get me a better graphics card so that I could play Far Cry. Yeah, the first one was indeed 2004.
It's a good year.
A very good year. But yeah, so that game and Crisis, it's, big brother or younger brother, younger, bigger brother. Those games existed as tech demos. I think gaming has roots in kind of the hacker culture. The idea that, hey, these computers are supposed to just crunch numbers and spreadsheets and all this fun stuff, but we can make them do fun things. We can make them into gaming machines, like how the first game was like tennis on an oscilloscope. And so even into the modern era, games sort of represent, like, it's sort of everybody knows games are bending computers into a shape they're not supposed to be in, like making them do something they really weren't designed to do. But nowadays we have enough infrastructure built up around it that it is normal. I am way off in the weeds, but the point is, graphics doesn't equal quality. we could say quality is, say, bugs per minute, but the fact is that there's some bugs you may never notice. There's some bugs that are show-stopping or really impede your experience with the game. There's some bugs that are forgivable and easy to overlook. And that's kind of, everyone has a different threshold, right? And so I would say that quality is going to be such a sliding scale that it's difficult to nail it down to say, oh, here's empirically how you can arrive at A plus B equals C. But I think especially as a comparison, if you're going to see about the same number of bugs per minute in a AAA game as an independent game, if you're going to see about the same graphics level, which thanks to Unity and Unreal kind of bundling these solutions into an all-in-one engine, audio, video, solutions, shaders, etc. You're able to at least arrive in the same ballpark as a AAA. You'll be using, say, Adobe textures, Substance Designer, you're using these different tools so you can look like a AAA even if you're just working out of your house, using asset packs, what have you. When that gap gets that narrow, then it really does become a matter of, oh, well, if I could pay $60 for a relatively similar experience to the 30 or 40 ones, and frankly, I've had more fun with the gameplay loops of some of the indies lately, because those are the ones that try new things and dare to fail and dare to succeed. They risk something by breaking out of genre conventions. Like, think about Phasmophobia. That would have been an impossible game to pitch to a board or focus grouping. People would have said, well, there's not enough game here. You're just kind of walking around, trying to figure out what ghost it is. You're not shooting things. Things aren't blowing up. It's really slow by design. Your character's like driving a tank, can't run very long, gets out of breath in 2 steps. But obviously that game has succeeded incredibly because people like to be scared and they like to watch people be scared. So as we talked about in a previous podcast, streamers have really driven the growth for that game. And it's a lot easier if you're going to be buying copies of a game for all the buddies to get on to say, hey, we all only have to pay $20 and we could all be playing this game. So right there, indies kind of tend to sell bundles in a sense because they are cheaper, and especially if they have a multiplayer component, it's so much easier to say, hey guys, let's all jump on this game, let's all buy a copy. And then they've sold 4 copies and they've probably made about the same net profit and whatnot as a AAA selling for 60 or 70, which I have seen some games that are 70 now.
Mm-hmm. Or more.
So the question was, how do you define quality? Well, it's subjective. And the one thing that can be said definitively is that the gap between indie and AAA when it comes to those subjective measurements of perceived bugs per hour or show-stopping issues or whether or not the graphics are bleeding edge, that gap isn't there anymore.
Yeah, I know gaming it's developing games as an art form, and art is subjective. So, but at the same time, I do think there are, obviously if that was the case, then all games would be good, right? There's obviously something that defines it. And I think you're right, though, it is down to personal preference, because for me, and I don't know, I guess it depends on the game, because I was like, but mostly I just want a game that works. First off, like when you press the button, it does the thing you want it to do, and the game doesn't just crash on you and wig out. Like, it actually performs correctly, that it's fun, that the overall concept isn't super repetitive, but it actually is something that you want to come back to and do better at. And it's something that you would share with others, that you would feel confident and feel good about talking about with other people or playing it with other people. It doesn't have to be even multiplayer, but if it's a game that's single player, but you want to talk to other people about the game or talk with people because they're playing it too. Those are the things I think of when I think of what makes a game quality, because, you look at a game like Ultimate Chicken Horse, and it's a game that it works exactly as it's supposed to. It's a lot of fun. The basic core concept is it executes very well what it sets out to do. And it is fun to talk about. I've talked to you about it. I've talked about it on the podcast. I talked to other people about it. And so that to me, it's a quality game. I would tell everyone to go buy that game. And I look at the games out there now, and as people already know, I'm a bit of a Nintendo person, and Nintendo doesn't always hit the mark, but they have a better track record, I feel like, with their games. You're talking about AAAs, who used to be when, developers would let their games cook until they were ready. Well, Nintendo's probably one of the few developers I know that does that. It took forever for the last Zelda game to come out, but when it came out, it was good. It worked. Mario games, they work. They come out, they're good. And I mean, I think if you want to get away from Nintendo, Baldur's Gate is a perfect example of a game that they took their time with it, and it was a quality game. It set the standard for what games should be. Sony does it pretty well too with their games. And so that's what AAA should be. But I think these third parties are the ones that are struggling because they're trying to pump out so many games and just not taking their time with them.
Yeah, Larian, just to point out, technically indie. If we do want to get a little bit empirical with how we define indie, let's do that. Let's come up with, because there's so many different ways to measure. Let's come up with the Orange Team podcast rubric for indie versus AAA.
Ooh, okay. Boy, where do we start? Like, how you start?
Let's do it. Let's do it like this. Let's say that let's come up with a point system. And if any combination of points exceeds some value, then that means it is or isn't. Let's say they're trying to earn the right to be indie, right? Mm-hmm. So let's say self-publishing is a point. Let's say a dev team under 50 members is a point. Let's say...
okay, so the goal is to be indie. So anytime more points is going to mean you're indie.
You're more likely to be indie.
More likely to be indie.
Even still, but let's say if you can get 5 points, then you're indie. So 1 point would be self-published. 1 point would be under 50 members to the dev team. Let's say that 1 point would be 1 point would be that you're privately owned. I think that once your company is publicly owned, that almost immediately invalidates it from being indie. Not necessarily, but that is a huge, I guess, red flag if you're looking for that indie flavor.
Should it be maybe less than so many games made?
Not necessarily, because I would love, and I think we will start to see more and more indie studios who make a career of it, who really make that their... what they do. Like Paradox, is it just Paradox Interactive? The people who do Crusader Kings? Let's see. Paradox Development Studio, Paradox Interactive. I think they might still be technically indie. And I'm not going to bend our rules to make sure that they end up classifying as indie, but I know that they're pretty much self-publishing. They're a big enough indie that I think they're publishing other indies. But I'm pretty sure they're still privately owned. It'd be news to me if they weren't. And they definitely still have the flavor. I'll give them that. But that's kind of I would say they're probably at the upper limit of... because I bet you they're way over 50 developers.
So self-publishing, under 50-member dev team, privately owned. I mean, what else can we use?
Man, Paradox has been buying up studios. I don't know. I would say lose a point if you've been acquiring studios. Oh my gosh. Oh, are they publicly traded? Well, Tencent owns 10% of them. They have 656 employees.
That's not a point. That's
that's a point against.
Oh my goodness.
When Tencent gets involved. 1.793 billion krona. What is a krona? Okay, the Kingdom of Sweden.
So
Swedish dollars.
So according to the Orange Team, if you self-publish, have a team under 50 members, and are privately owned, you are more likely to be indie. Maybe not definitively. I don't know if we have... do we have empirically definitive you are indie?
I I would say, you know what, and I talked a big game about maybe coming up with 5 points, but maybe those three really are that's our fast, you know, keep it in your pocket if you want to real quick figure out if you're dealing with an indie or not. Those 3 points can get you probably 90% of the way there.
Okay.
And then there's probably a bunch of nuances we could cover. Let's take a look at Larian real quick.
They're pretty big. They're not.
They are.
So I mean, it's hard to call them indie. I mean, like okay, like CD Projekt Red too. Like, aren't they kind of?
Larian has 450 employees, but they are privately owned. I do happen to know that some portion of the company is owned by Tencent, which this is the third time I think I've mentioned Tencent. Tencent is just a big corporation out of China that likes to buy up a lot of different studios and have their fingers in a lot of different pies. And so once they get involved and have an ownership stake in a company, like that's kind of a mark against it being an indie, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm pretty sure Larian is still majority owned by Sven.
So they get like 2 out of 3, kind of.
Yeah, and that's where it's like they might still technically be indie, but they're starting to lean away from it.
It's
privately owned.
It's hard to. That's again where it's like I think there's certain companies that start indie, but I don't know if you can call them indie anymore. I mean, technically, you think about it, a lot of these companies, like Valve, was indie at one point. I mean,
Valve might still technically be indie, honestly.
That's a really hard sell to call them indie.
Right. But think about it. They're privately owned. There's no real board.
They got more than 50 people, though.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. Like, but you start...
I don't think they have 450, though.
No.
Yeah, see, it's tough.
It's tough. But yeah, I mean, yeah, if you... But so it's like... We've kind of created this arbitrary, like anyone who publishes under these companies, they're not indie. But anyone outside of that, they're indie. It kind of seems to me like the more definitive metric we're giving at this point. It's like if you're published by EA, Ubisoft, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, basically some billion-dollar corporation, then you're not indie. But if you don't fall into that...
We'll revisit this.
We definitely need to revisit.
This is
stage
something one. You know,
everyone listening, get in the comments. Tell us.
Yeah, tell us what you think.
Tell us what you think because we're at an impasse, and I think that it's a lot more gray now than it ever used to be. And I think
we're gonna make it worse.
I think we made it worse.
No,
but I think but this is a good topic. We have to talk about this stuff because I think the world's changing. This is why I brought the subject because I think AAA definition of that's changing. The definition of indie is changing. The quality of both is changing. There's like almost like they're kind of starting to. I don't want to say they're meeting in the middle, but there's a new middle class of gaming now. I feel like because indie used to be like quick, cheap like games. Like to me anyway, they were like quick hits. They weren't always that polished. They were funny. Like you're like, haha, it's so silly because it's small and short and fun and maybe a little quirky. But now indie games are like, I mean, come on, like think of Stardew Valley. Like that game is so much content, so many hours you can pour into that. It's like it's not even. I don't know. It's just, yes, it's changing. But I'm glad it's changing because it basically, all it is more competition. And these big companies have to start paying attention because, and people need to start voting with their wallets too a little bit. I think there's just a group of people that just genuinely follow a brand regardless. And I'll use this as an example for me. Like I obviously love Nintendo games, but there was a season where they were pumping out some games and I'm like, these suck. It was like in the part of the Wii U 3DS era where like all the Zelda games were like it was like Triforce Heroes, and I remember during the DS there was Spirit Tracks, and it's not that they were bad, they just didn't draw me in, and there was just certain games that in series that I loved that I just chose not to buy because they just didn't do it for me, even though I love those series. But I hope that people do the same. They're like, hey, Call of Duty be looking the same for a while. Like they need to kind of, and they kind of try to reinvent themselves, but they're chasing trends. Like Warzone was them just chasing the battle royale trend, and I think are they going after the Oh, the extraction shooter genre. I think they're going after that too.
Maybe. I mean, the one thing they for sure aren't going after is the, single player campaign audience anymore.
Yeah, because there's no money from that. That's the
There
thing.
isn't.
But again, this comes back. We're gonna just circling back. The
Well,
the well because like think about like we're
let,
talking about the
let
30. You were talking about the $30 DLC. Like that's what they push because they have to pay for these massive companies. And we used to be like, oh, that's
yep.
tipping your developer, but it's not tipping the developer. It's just tipping the publisher now.
Right. But to your point about there's no money in that. Indies beg to differ.
Well, no. Sorry, I don't mean that there's no
There's no
money.
renewable money.
There's no renewable money, and when I
Right.
say that, like an indie, because they are so lean and they are able to come up with, they don't need a huge team to come up with great content. They don't have a massive HR department and a finance department and a legal department and like all these other departments to run their company because they're so just insanely big. Like a place like Blizzard has to have all those departments and pay for all those people and a massive marketing department. Whereas a lot of these indies, they're mostly developers with maybe a few other people that help with some of the business stuff, maybe. And that's why they're able to work so lean and make so much money. And then they're not distributing physically. They're not pumping ads through Super Bowls, right? They're just word of mouth through streamers, and it does really well. And so if they make $1 million, they're doing really, really well. Right. Versus a studio like Activision, like they have to make $200 million just to break even. So they need, and so just selling the game by itself isn't enough for them because they might just break even. They want all the extra money. Of course, they have shareholders. That's another thing too. But you're right. Indies beg to differ. But basically, the reason why indies work is because they're not so bloated. They don't have as many people. And you could say, well, that's not true because you look at Larian, they have 430 people, and, but I don't know. They just know that like, if they just keep making quality games, their games will sell. And
they found their niche.
And they're not greedy.
Right.
They're
well, and so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No. I was done. That was my point.
So so on the topic of there not being any money, or more accurately, renewable money in single player games. That's what indies are uniquely situated to remedy. Early, like 90s era gaming. Now, granted, this was before the advent of the internet. But obviously, 90s era gaming was dominated by stories, adventures. Think about the Monkey Island series by LucasArts. Think about even Doom. I mean, Doom obviously had, and Quake, they had multiplayer, but it wasn't assumed that everyone had access to, the hardware and infrastructure necessary to be able to deathmatch with their friends. And so there was obviously a single player campaign for all of those games. Half-Life, it was a single player game first. They told this story, put you in the hazard suit of Gordon Freeman, and the Half-Life Deathmatch was a really nice add-on that added a ton, but it was not the core drive of the game. It wasn't until going into the 2000s, so Counter-Strike 1.6, so the modding scene, mods being free to download, and also thanks to the modding tools Valve put out, easy for anybody to throw something together. That was where they were experimenting with these different types of games, and Counter-Strike came out of that. And Team Fortress Classic, I know that came from inside Valve, but it really was a Quake mod that then kind of got promoted by Valve hiring the developers who made it. And that's where people were experimenting with these new types of games that were multiplayer first or multiplayer only. And then into the 2000s, every game had multiplayer. Now we've seen the shift to where some games are, the single player is barely an afterthought.
Multiplayer, I think, was like a marketing thing.
Yeah.
Because...
play with your friends.
Well, because there's a thing. That's how you get your friends to talk about it, because you're playing with them, right? It's almost like it forces the conversation because you need friends to play multiplayer. So you talk about your game with your friends, they get the game, and then that's kind of how. And I'm not saying multiplayer is bad. It's just it's. But I think that was kind of why people started tacking it on, is because they saw their games sold better when there was multiplayer, because it was a marketing means of spreading word of mouth.
Right. And I think you're right. And nowadays they do that same thing. Multiplayer games, you're watching streamers play, and you and your buddies are, where we dropping boys. I think that's why the squad size for battle royales, or like for Warzone, is 3, right? Like that's just the right number to be able to get people together each evening without feeling like, oh man, we can't fill out a 5-man team. Like we can't go 5v5 in Counter-Strike. But I said all that to say, humankind, back to our earliest days, we tell stories, and that's how we share information and knowledge, anecdotes, tips and tricks. That's how we process the world around us. That's how we deal with trauma in our own lives. That's how we grow as people, is through the creation and hearing of stories. We, I'm, oh man, what I want to say is like incredibly old man yells at cloud, but I will say that we don't sit down to listen to stories very often anymore, or if the story's longer than 7 seconds, you know what I mean?
I understand. Yeah, it's something that's hit deep for me, and I think for you too, because I know you are a passionate storyteller, someone who's very, who's written stories, has made games with stories, and is just. And for me, I'm not as good of a storyteller, but I love stories that my family have passed down, my grandfather and my dad, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but I just watched the movie Big Fish. Have you seen that movie?
Have not.
Okay, actually. It's directed by Tim Burton, came out in, I think, 2003. I think you'd really like it. It's essentially, I'm trying to summarize it without spoiling anything, but essentially it's the story, this man is telling these stories about his life and all the adventures he had, but he kind of gives them a little bit more flair. He's, like tall tales almost, but they all have some element of truth to them. But his son is frustrated with his dad because he feels like he doesn't know his dad's really true background, because his dad tells these tall tales. He doesn't know what's true or not. And the whole message of the thing is like, well, if you had to pick between just the facts and a good story, what are you really going to pick? And the son always just kind of gives the bullet points of what happened in his life, whereas his dad tells these beautiful, elaborate tales that maybe aren't 100% true. There's some embellishment, but they're so engaging and people remember them, and he was this well-liked man. And it's just such an amazing story. I was basically almost crying at the end because of how much it meant to me, the whole aspect of it, because I grew up listening to the stories of my elders and the things that they went through, and they would tell it in such a way that I was just so engaged. And, I'm sure that they embellish some of it a little bit. I think part of the whole reason the movie's called Big Fish is kind of about fishermen and how they always talk about, the fish was this big, right? And it's not.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what, we seek, is that good storytelling, right? Even if it's not 100% true, or if it's, a lot of stuff the stories that you and I are very interested in are completely not true. They're completely not real. But there's so much, there's truth in them. There's morals, there's messages, there's emotions and feelings and conflict and resolution and things that apply to us as humans. And so, it's so important that we have these stories, whether it be through video games or movies or books or shows or whatever. And in gaming, I think it has been kind of steering away from that storytelling a little bit, which is, I mean, I'm not going to say that, games should be stories, because I think some of the best games of my life are ones that had no story. They were just fun. They're puzzles, they're brain teasers, or they're just fun little goofy things. But at the same time, some of the best memories I've ever had are through game stories. And just the way you feel and the characters and being that character too. That's a whole different aspect of being able to experience the story through a character, especially the mute ones. When you play as either Link in Legend of Zelda or you play as Gordon Freeman in Half-Life, and you are truly the character, and it's yeah, I do think that we need to be able to get some of that back, but we got to figure out how to make it so that the developers still can put food on the table. And I think indies are finding a way because they're not bloating it out of proportion. You don't have to have the craziest budget to make those stories. You can make those games. Undertale, perfect example. You can make great stories, great games without blowing your budget, and people will love it. A good story is a good story, no matter how it's presented. Well, okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and that's Undertale found that there was an underserved section of the market that just wanted a good story.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, I'm going to paraphrase. I don't know if it was C.S. Lewis or Tolkien or how it, I know that I think Tolkien wrote an essay called On Fairy Stories discussing how, to paraphrase, sometimes the greatest truths of human experience have to come wrapped in a fairy tale. And that's how we share them and come to understand them, to almost hold them up to the light and watch it refract through them, and come to understand their shape and size and purpose. And I think games are just an incredible vehicle for that, being an interactive medium. Stories aren't just single player campaigns like Undertale. I think some of my favorite gaming stories arose out of Halo multiplayer because those were shared sandbox experiences. Everybody running around in Blood Gulch, 4v4, and just honestly, it comes back to human experience, human interaction, and then single player is just it's kind of funny because then there is no human interaction, obviously, but stories are still powerful, right?
Yeah.
I just finished a book last night for the first time in a very long time, and I'm still riding high off of that. It's just good. It's good. A good story is good and sticks with you,
Mm-hmm.
And I was just thinking to myself how, I can't let that get lost in the sauce of what we're doing, making games. The ultimate goal is to create a connection with the person playing, to tell them a good story, to not worry about embellishing aspects of it, and to just hopefully give them a little bit of hope, a little bit of something to get them fired up to create their own things, or maybe a hero who modeled something they needed at that point in life,
Yeah. It's funny to talk about stories and multiplayer too. I was just thinking how there's just different ways that stories are created, right? Right. Stories like stories made, stories you witness, like the story in a game that's made by a developer, and it can make you feel a certain way, and you can talk to other people about how you felt. Like I'm not going to spoil it, but there's aspects of Half-Life Alyx that just I can talk to you about and you can talk to me about. It's just like, whoa, do you remember that scene? Yeah, that scene was crazy. That just blew my mind, and the experience of that and the story. But then there's the stories that are created through that multiplayer, like you said, the Halo stories, the stories that aren't really necessarily in the game per se, but that the game helped create. And so then those are more, I guess, real stories in the sense of events that we did. But either way, a story is a story, and
right.
And there's, how it's, what, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but yeah, there's just a lot of feelings and stuff where,
yeah, I know where you're going with that.
Where am I going with
stories
that?
Stories aren't just told through games or novels. They're also told through movies and television.
They are told through movies and television, which you're right. That does kind of perfectly segue into our last topic. It's going to be a shorter one, but I think it's an interesting one because we've been talking about big companies and how they are becoming a bit bloated and challenged. And I feel to a certain extent losing touch, not just with the content they create, but our wallets and how much we can afford. And
for sure,
and I'm this is going to switch over to, instead of just games, but streaming, though actually, weirdly enough, they're starting to become a little bit more closer aligned than we would like to think. Back in the day when we were younger, you either had, over-the-air TV, which was free, which is cool, and they had ads, and that's fine. There weren't as many channels, but if you wanted to get all the main content that was out there, you had a cable package or satellite, one of the two, same thing, basically. And, you'd buy these packages. And they were kind of expensive. You'd spend a lot of money to get access to this stuff. And then along comes a little company called Netflix that nobody believed in, not even Blockbuster. And they said, you know what? We're gonna try this thing where you can watch movies online. Kind of like, like YouTube's doing this thing. Maybe we can put movies on the internet and you pay us a fee and we'll do that. And people are like, sure, why not? No one's gonna do that. So they got a lot of licensing, and suddenly everybody wanted to do that. And like, wow, streaming's cool. And we were paying like next to nothing and getting access to so much content. It was the best value. It just made no sense to buy movies or rent them any other way. It was like $6 or $7 a month, and the price of a movie ticket, or back then, or renting something, you got unlimited watching. Well, now fast forward, everybody and their dog's got a streaming platform. And not only now it's segregated the content, and now if you want to watch all the different content that's out there, you have to pay all this money, and it's getting to the point now where it costs as much as a cable package, if not more, and you don't even really get all the content. There's still certain content that's just not on any streaming platform, and it's getting kind of wild. So I just been like, the titles, are we streaming to our doom? It's like we've kind of gone full circle, and I'm getting a little tired of having content pulled away from a service. Or actually, the big thing that's been happening now is the inability to share an account. So, I would share a Netflix account with family and a Disney Plus account with family. And it wasn't like I was giving it to everybody. It was like maybe one or two other people, max. And now that doesn't work. I mean, some of them I was getting the benefit from someone else, and vice versa. We're kind of trading places. Like, you pay for this one, I pay for that one. And now we can't watch that stuff. So I'm kind of like, I just don't have the money for that. So
there's another value proposition that's been absolutely annihilated. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to bring this up while we're here. Inflation is a heck of a drug, but in order to not get annihilated on my monthly fees, I have had to opt into the with ads versions of a couple of different streaming services. So all of a sudden, I am streaming my content and I'm still getting commercial breaks, the same as I would have on cable. And that was another major value proposition that streaming services had all touted from the beginning. Hey, come pay for this. It's ad-free as much as you want. Binge it all.
Mm-hmm.
And now we are right back to where we started. And how did we get here?
It's just a lot of reasons. Again, this comes back to companies creating content with way too big of budgets rather than just finding ways to create engaging content that doesn't require $200 million an episode. And, obviously everyone's fighting for your attention. And so, and then the cost of bandwidth is going up. There's more people using it, and everyone wants 4K, which is incredibly expensive to stream. And so we're trying to come up with new codecs to offset that so the bandwidth isn't completely tanked, because everybody's streaming on their phones and their computers and their TVs. A lot more, actually, TV streaming has gotten a lot heavier lately. I've been looking at the analytics. So I guess a lot more YouTube's being consumed on TVs now than ever used to. And yeah, it's just, and of course they just want, a lot of the streaming companies, we didn't realize this till later, but they were operating at a loss. They were tech startups. And so they would just get as many people on board and then just pull the rug from us and be like, all right, now it costs this much because we actually need to be profitable now. And we didn't know that they weren't profitable. We thought, sweet, this is such a good deal. You guys are making money. We're getting good content. Everybody wins. Well, it turns out that wasn't the case. And now we're all losing because, as if they don't think they're losing because they're making more money and being profitable, but we're all questioning whether this is a good value proposition anymore. So what I've started to do is I still have a lot of DVDs and Blu-rays that I used to buy. If I liked a movie, I'd buy it. And I'm at the point now where I'm like, instead of paying for these subscription services, I could be buying one or two movies a month and just own them. And they're better quality than what you stream. Not by a lot. I think streaming's not that bad, but I mean, a 4K Blu-ray looks pretty good on a 4K TV. And so I've started to rip the movies. So I am going perfectly legal. I'm just ripping the movies I have. I know some
You're not
people.
sailing the seven
I'm
seas
not sailing the seven seas, and I would
of
definitely
Ast.
never admit that on a podcast.
Linus Sebastian would like a word with you.
Yeah, I know he has his thoughts. Well, and Louis Rossman and different people, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna, for the time being, because I'm just dipping my toes in this right now. I'm not like going full bore. I don't have a massive library, and I'm also not a huge content consumer. If there's something I like, I watch it, but I don't sit on a streaming service and be like, I just have time to burn, and I'm gonna watch this. I just don't have that kind of free time anymore. Plus, I like video
Yep.
games, so if there's games, will take up a lot of my time. It leaves less time for movies and TV. So, but I do have some movies I like, and then my kids really like watching, certain Bluey and stuff, and so I can put it on there. So what I've started doing is I'm building myself a Jellyfin server, and it's been such a fun process to learn and to get it working, and it's just so nice too because I can have it running in my house. It uses zero internet, so it doesn't matter how fast or slow the internet is. I get full quality anytime I want. I can it just, there's no buffering. There's just no, the only issue is I can't really watch it outside my house. But to be honest, I don't really do that anyway. And there are ways around it, but I haven't gone down that road. I'm taking baby steps. But yeah, I think that that's something that people are looking more into. I've seen more videos of people saying like need to go back to having physical media and owning our content again because these companies
Yep.
have decided we don't own it. So, and another example of this is Sony had a streaming service on PlayStation, and people were buying movies on there. And what people soon realized was that Sony lost the rights to certain movies, and so those movies just got pulled from that service, whether you bought them or not. And those people just lost the movie. They paid full price for that movie. It's just gone. They were trying to be a good little citizen that bought their, digital copy. And the thing is, too, is those companies made a lot of money off the digital copy because they didn't have to physically make it and distribute it and ship it and all that stuff. So they made more money off the digital.
They didn't refund the buyers at that point.
No, they didn't refund the buyers. Nothing. They're just like, you got your value out of it. Now you have to go buy it again somewhere else. I'm like, well, that's messed up. So even when you think you're
Yep.
buying a digital version on Amazon or any other service, you don't actually own that movie. So I'm like, no, I'm going to buy the physical ones so I own the movie because I want to watch these movies again one day, and I don't want to be trying to fight to find what streaming service is on, or maybe in 10, 20 years, the streaming service is going to be double or triple the cost per month, and that's crazy. But these movies I'll just have.
Well, and talk about supporting your favorite creators. The difference between, say, streaming someone's music on Spotify or purchasing their album, let's say on iTunes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is the difference between pennies and dollars, talking about the compensation they're going to receive. Now, obviously, especially if you're published through iTunes, it's when I say dollars, it's not like I still don't think they get the majority of that money, but it is a big difference from fractions of a cent per stream to where they may only be getting some of the biggest names in the world are only getting 5-figure paychecks, I think, from Spotify in a given year.
Yeah.
And that's obviously, streaming, it's just not cutting it.
I
Not
know.
anymore.
I think we drank the Kool-Aid. We loved it because it was cheap and affordable, and we had access to everything all at once. It was super great. And I still think that there's a value to it. I mean, and music's kind of one of those places that hasn't quite got hit the same way as streaming has, because for the most part, if you subscribe to Apple Music or Spotify, you pretty much have all the same songs. There's a few things that they're trying to make exclusive, but overall, you pay for one service and you get it all. Whereas with videos and movies and in TV, it's like it's not the case. So it's a much more volatile, more expensive market to be in. So, but yeah, I agree. The compensation side for the artists is just completely shifted. But that's why I like supporting creator artists online. I follow Corridor Digital, and I subscribe to their private site, and I watch their content through there, which is less compressed. I get exclusives, and I like the stuff they make, and I support them that way. And it's not that expensive. And, there are different YouTubers that I like to follow. I haven't, I only have so much money I can throw at different creators. But one thing I discovered from watching Linus Tech Tips was that, so I'm a YouTube premium subscriber because I don't want to watch the ads on there. And I found out that they actually get compensated better if you're a YouTube premium subscriber.
Right.
So the watch time becomes better. They get more money from that. So I was like, well, that's kind of cool to know. And I don't know if it's changed since that video was launched, but I thought that was a very fascinating thing. So people I'm watching on YouTube are getting paid better because I'm watching their stuff versus just watching ads, which is also pretty detrimental to the model they have, since most people do watch it for free. So you have to wonder
Right.
how sustainable all this stuff is. So, but that's a conversation topic for another time. For now, I think that's gonna wrap it up. I think this has been a really fun conversation. I think we got to talk about some pretty fun topics that we're both very interested and passionate about. Mitch, what do you think?
Well, just to wrap up, your last point here, streaming to our doom. You said, are we just spoiled brats that expect this content to be cheap or free forever, and we just don't like paying what it actually costs to make this stuff? I think you spoke to that point really well, talking about like corridor digital. Like, pirate's gonna pirate, right? But
Mm-hmm.
you and I, like, we want to support the people making stuff we like. And like we'll go get that corridor digital subscription. We'll sub to our friends and just content creators we enjoy on Twitch, or go buy an LTT shirt from lttstore.com. But like I think that's really just it, right? Like it's we're not necessarily spoiled. It's just that the balance has shifted. Streaming is not the value it used to be. They either have a lot of work to do to recover the ground they've lost, or they're going to see more and more people like you and I willing to go spin up our own jellyfin servers and just buy physical copies, rip it to the server, and set up a VPN and watch it wherever we want.
Yep.
Which, by the way, let's talk about that after the show. I'll get you set up with a VPN. And as a potential topic for NordVPN, this sponsor. No, we're not sponsored by anybody.
Not yet.
But not yet. But on the topic of, I think that'd be a great season 2 topic, is to dedicate an episode to spinning up your own home lab and like what it takes and what you'll need to learn, and getting set up with Jellyfin, or if you want to just have network accessible storage or run a Valheim server, whatever. That might be a fun topic. We'll keep that in the back pocket.
Yeah. Let us know in the comments if that's something you'd like to hear more about, and we'll definitely add that to our season 2. So season 2 will be, just for people knowing, to know, we're going to have our first season is 10 episodes. So we're on episode 7 right now. And then season 2 is going to be pretty exciting. We're working on some pretty cool stuff. We've got a few ideas how we're going to try and spruce this whole thing up. So keep listening, keep watching. We appreciate you guys. If you really like this episode, please, give it a like, subscribe, follow, tell your friends, all those things. But yeah, we appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to us. And so I'm Leighton. He's Mitch. This is the Orange Team Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.